Here's a short clip from a prior episode of Emphasis Added. Hope you enjoy. I wanted to talk a little bit about satellites because I think they're such a big part of everybody's life. It's probably maybe affected the most by space. I mean, to just to figure out like where to park today, I had pulled up a satellite image of the school.
The iPhone.
And looked at it. Yeah. I mean, just to drive anywhere, you've got GPS going. And so I think there's currently like thousands of active satellites orbiting the Earth, but with the prominence of private companies entering the space industry, especially with like these internet satellite constellations, there's going to be, I think Starlight, SpaceX's company, and Amazon and these other companies have talked about pushing tens of thousands of satellites in the next decade. And so just last week, OneWeb, a United Kingdom's internet satellite constellation company, accused SpaceX of having a near collision with one of their Starlink satellites. It didn't happen, but I guess it raises the question, and I think you've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but how are these satellites tracked and regulated, and is anyone overseeing this part of Earth's orbit to make sure that these sorts of things don't occur?
Yeah, so I think that there's two issues there. First, you asked who tracks the satellites, and that's U.S. Space Command, and that's actually now, as I understand, it's under Space Force. So that's the Air Force, now Space Force, that does the tracking with their Deep Space Network tracking system. But it's difficult. There's a lot out there. There's other nations as well that does tracking also. So that's not the only entity that does tracking, and countries do share information.
Okay.
But I think that the big second issue, though, is management of what is in space. And that has been such a prominent question currently with the past administration. I'm guessing it's going to be possibly taken on by the current administration, of how do you manage what's in space? Who manages what's in space? There were talks about possibly FAA doing it. There was support in the last administration with the Department of Commerce taking over that role. Currently, we do not have an entity that does that. The other difficult thing is, so if you have a collision of two satellites and you're trying to determine, well, who's responsible? Who's liable for that?
Yeah.
So you have the Liability Convention, and the Liability Convention says, well, when you have two satellites crash or you have damage caused in outer space, you use what's called fault liability. Okay. So who's ever at fault? But the question is, well, who is at fault if you have no rules of the road?
Yeah, and if both these things are just floating around out there.
Exactly. So in addition to management of what's out there, we need some sort of set rules of who's responsible to do what in certain circumstances. So that's also something else that's missing right now in our legal regime of outer space.
What would happen if, say two different country satellites collide? Because it's happened in the past, right? At least one other time, or?
It has. The Liability Convention wasn't used. You would look at fault, but who's at fault? Mm-hmm. And that's the difficulty. And so, one entity would have to show that the other entity's at fault. It's a little difficult to determine who's at fault when you're in outer space. So if you have a satellite that's defunct and another one that's not, who has the responsibility to move out of the way? Mm-hmm. There are no rules that say one person has to move out of the way if they can, or the other one that's defunct, do they need to go up and grab their satellite and deorbit it? Or so because you don't have those rules, it's really difficult to figure out fault. So a lot of those companies, if they're smart, they have very good insurance coverage.
That's always the solution when the law isn't sure.
Or and parties I would guess also would settle as well.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I guess in a hypothetical where satellites were to crash, or even just generally, like, you're going to have space debris. I think the European Space Agency has estimated there's millions of pieces of space debris floating around in the orbit. I mean, not all of them are big, but I think they said like tens of thousands or over like 10 centimeters in size. And I know the movie Gravity, I think in the beginning it shows like the catastrophic worst case scenario where space debris is just flying
everywhere.
at hundreds of miles an hour, hitting satellites, breaking things apart. And while that's the worst case scenario, I think just even in the less worst case scenario of just there being all this debris around, I mean, it seems to be problematic. And so I wonder, who, if anyone's responsible for cleaning it up?
Yeah, so that's actually another very good question. So for cleaning up, there are no rules right now.
Okay.
What countries have done, and actually NASA and the United States really being the beginning force of putting forth some debris mitigation guidelines, and other countries have done that as well. There's an interagency working group also of all the different space agencies that work together on how to mitigate debris. The UN has also taken this on. So it's not that it's an issue that's being completely ignored, but the problem is you have to get all of these countries to agree how you're going to mitigate the debris.
Yeah.
And then if you're talking about who's responsible for removing debris, well, how do you determine that? Is it by a percentage of how much a country puts up into space? Is it, who pays for that? Because the expense would be pretty great.
I mean, it's like trying to solve pollution problems internationally.
Exactly. No, that's actually that's a really good analogy. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, I mean, right now, say the U.S. wanted to clean up debris, say like caused by like a Chinese satellite or something. I mean, do we have to ask for permission? Can we clean it up because it's pieces of debris floating around? And is anyone even going to care? Do these things happen?
Yeah. So, who owns that piece of space debris?
I mean, I would assume if it's from the launching state, then it's still their debris.
It's their debris. So,
so are we like trespassing on their territory by taking that debris? And
that's exactly the legal issue. So, what is a space object, and how do you define space debris?
Yeah.
So, you have some really good rules of the road of what you can do when a ship has been left at sea, and someone can go fix it. And if they put the money into it, they can then actually then own the ship.
Okay.
But up in space, you don't have those same rules. So again, who owns it? And we don't have a really good definition of space debris. And so if we went and took a piece of space debris, I always say what is one man's junk is another man's treasure.
Yeah.
So, hey, the Chinese could come back and say, that's my satellite. That's a piece of my satellite. And
yeah, that metal's expensive.
Yeah.
I mean,
or
the tech in it.
Or exactly. Or if you take a piece that they are concerned about, and you don't want to do that because if they do it in return, I don't think we would appreciate it either. So
right. Yeah.
But again, too, it's the expense of it as well. Would we really take on the expense to start removing Chinese debris?
Well, what about in the U.S.? I mean, we already have some companies that are pushing out these internet satellite constellations. I'm assuming, not to go super into who gets authorization, but I'm assuming there's going to be a company that's going to put a bunch of satellites into space that's going to go bankrupt. And in this instance where somebody doesn't buy all the satellites and there's just these unclaimed satellites floating around orbit, I mean, in that instance, what happens? I mean, does the U.S. take responsibility and clean those up, or do we take liability if they crash into something else? Does the country have to assume that?
So, again, another very good question.
Sorry.
So there was a company recently that did go bankrupt.
Okay.
It was a UK-based company, but it filed bankruptcy in the United States.
Interesting.
In that circumstance, though, the bank took ownership, resold the company. So in an instance where you'd have a company that has those types of assets, have a bunch of satellites,
someone's going to want that.
Somebody is going to want that. They are going to resell that company to keep the company going.
Okay.
And the company would then own those satellites. Now, but the interesting thing is if you, so in that instance, the UK government took ownership of those satellites. But you raised a really good question. So the launching state, depending on who the launching state is, or the launching entity, could you transfer ownership, or could you transfer who the launching state is up in space? So that is a really good question.
I hope you enjoyed that short clip from a prior episode of Emphasis Added, a podcast by the Houston Law Review. If you like what you saw, check out more on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform.